In the winter of 1887, when the snow lay thick across the Montana Territory, a woman named Cordelia Thorne stepped off a freight wagon in the town of Bitterroot Creek, carrying nothing but a torn shawl and the weight of a transaction that would reshape an empire. She had been sold for 3 bottles of rye whiskey and a handful of silver coins. Within 5 years, she would own more land than any man west of the Mississippi. This is the story of how silence became her greatest weapon, and how a broken woman built a kingdom from dust. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Cordelia Thorne's father gambled her away, the temperature dropped to 20 below zero, and the whiskey in Jeremiah Caldwell's glass froze solid before he could finish his drink. Jeremiah sat across from Thomas Thorne in the back room of McReady's saloon, watching the desperate man's hands shake as he reached for the cards one more time. "I ain't got nothing left, Caldwell," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking like ice on a pond. "Lost the farm 2 hands back. Lost my horses. Lost my pride somewhere between here and hell." Jeremiah said nothing. He never did. In 38 years of life, the man had spoken fewer words than most people uttered in a single heated argument. His silence had earned him respect, fear, and a cattle empire that stretched from the Yellowstone River to the Canadian border. When Jeremiah Caldwell wanted something, he simply waited until the world arranged itself to give it to him. Thomas Thorne's bloodshot eyes darted around the smoky room. "But I got something else, something that might interest a man like you." Jeremiah's pale blue eyes remained fixed on Thomas, unblinking as a hawk studying prey. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew 3 bottles of Kentucky rye, placing them on the scarred wooden table with the deliberate precision of a man who had never made a hasty decision in his life. "My daughter," Thomas continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "She's 23, strong as an ox, and she knows her way around livestock better than most men. Course, well, she ain't exactly what you'd call a beauty. Girl's got some weight on her, and she's been through some troubles. But she's got good birthing hips, and she can work from dawn to dusk without complaint." The silence stretched between them like a taut rope. Outside, the wind howled through the gaps in the saloon's weathered walls, carrying with it the promise of another brutal Montana winter. Jeremiah's massive hands remained perfectly still on the table, but something flickered behind his eyes, not desire, not pity, but calculation. Thomas leaned forward desperately. "She can read and write too. Taught herself from my late wife's books. And she's got a head for numbers that'd make a banker jealous. Hell, she's been running what's left of our operation since I took to drinking heavy after Martha died." Jeremiah reached for the whiskey bottles, his calloused fingers drumming once against the glass. Then he stood, his 6'4" frame casting a long shadow across the table. Without a word, he walked to the window and stared out at the snow-covered street, where a lone figure sat hunched on a wooden crate beside a loaded freight wagon. Cordelia Thorne knew she was being discussed like livestock. She had known it the moment her father's eyes took on that particular combination of desperation and calculation that she had seen too many times before. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders and watched her breath form small clouds in the frigid air. At 23, Cordelia had long since abandoned any illusions about her place in the world. She was not the kind of woman men wrote poetry about or fought duels over. Her body was soft and round where fashion demanded sharp angles. Her hands were rough from years of hard labor, and her face bore the permanent lines of someone who had learned early that life was a series of transactions where she was almost always the currency. But Cordelia possessed something that most people overlooked, a mind sharp enough to cut glass and a will that had been tempered in fires that would have broken weaker souls. She had been running her family's failing ranch. For 3 years, ever since her mother's death had sent her father spiraling into a bottle. She knew exactly how many cattle they had left, how much feed would be needed to get through the winter, and precisely how many days they could survive on the contents of their nearly empty grain bin. She also knew that today, in that saloon, her father would lose her in a card game. Through the frost-covered window, she watched a tall man in expensive coat emerge from Mikrides and approach the freight wagon. This had to be Jeremiah Caldwell, the silent baron himself. She had heard stories about him from traveling merchants and cowhands, how he had arrived in Montana Territory 15 years ago with nothing but a worn saddle and a head full of ambitions, how he had built his empire through a combination of shrewd deals and strategic silence that made other men nervous enough to accept his terms without negotiation. Jeremiah stopped 3 feet from where Cordelia sat and studied her with those pale eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's bones. Up close, she could see that his face was weathered but not unkind, marked by years of hard work under an unforgiving sun. His hands, she noticed, were clean despite their obvious familiarity with manual labor. "Miss Thorne," he said, and his voice was surprisingly gentle, like distant thunder rolling across summer plains. "Mr. Caldwell," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I suppose congratulations are in order. You've just acquired yourself a ranch hand who comes with the added benefit of basic literacy." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. "Your father says you're good with numbers. Better than he is, which isn't saying much considering he just traded his only daughter for whiskey." Cordelia stood, brushing snow from her worn skirt. "But yes, I can keep books, calculate feed costs, estimate market prices, and tell you exactly how much money you'll save by buying me instead of hiring proper ranch hands." Jeremiah nodded slowly. "Get in the wagon. Just like that?" "Just like that." As the freight wagon pulled away from Bitterroot Creek, Cordelia turned for one last look at the only life she had ever known. The town looked smaller from the back of a moving wagon, its buildings hunched against the cold like animals seeking shelter. She could see her father stumbling out of Mikrides' saloon, already working on one of the bottles that had purchased her freedom from his failures. The wagon driver, a grizzled man named Pete Hawkins who worked for Caldwell's outfit, glanced back at her with something that might have been sympathy. "First time leaving home?" "First time being sold," Cordelia replied matter-of-factly. "Though I suspect it won't be the last time my circumstances change dramatically." Hawkins chuckled despite himself. "The boss doesn't usually explain his thinking, but I reckon he sees something in you that your daddy missed." "My father sees the bottom of a whiskey bottle more clearly than he sees anything else these days." Cordelia pulled her shawl tighter as the wind picked up. "What's Caldwell's ranch like?" "Big," Hawkins said simply. "Biggest spread in 3 territories. He's got nearly 10,000 head of cattle, more horses than you can count, and enough land to start his own country if he had a mind to." The wagon rolled steadily northward, following a rutted trail that wound through valleys carved by ancient glaciers and streams that ran year-round despite the brutal winters. As they traveled, Hawkins pointed out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation that marked the beginning of Caldwell's territory, a line of fence posts that stretched to the horizon, a distant cluster of buildings that housed some of the ranch hands and their families. "That there's the south pasture," Hawkins said, gesturing toward a vast expanse of snow-covered grassland. "Come spring, you'll see more cattle than you ever imagined possible. Boss has got breeding stock from as far away as Scotland and Texas. Spent years building up bloodlines that can survive these winters and still put on weight." Cordelia studied the landscape with the eye of someone who understood the economics of ranching. Even under the snow, she could see that this was prime grazing land, protected valleys with natural windbreaks, access to water, and the kind of rich soil that would produce excellent grass come spring. This was not land that a man acquired through luck or inheritance. This was land that had been chosen with care and claimed through strategic thinking. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains, they created a hill that revealed the heart of Caldwell's empire. The main house was not the modest ranch-dwelling Cordelia had expected, but a substantial two-story structure built from local stone and timber, with wide porches and windows that reflected the golden light like watchful eyes. Surrounding it were barns, corrals, bunkhouses, and outbuildings arranged with the efficiency of a small town. "Boss built it all himself," Hawkins said, noting her surprise. "Started with a one-room cabin and just kept adding on as the operation grew. That big barn there can hold enough hay to feed 1,000 head through a hard winter. The one next to it houses the breeding bulls, finest stock you'll find anywhere west of Chicago." They pulled up to the main house just as Jeremiah emerged from what appeared to be an office building adjacent to the residence. He had changed from his town clothes into work gear, leather chaps, a heavy coat, and boots that had seen serious use. Without a word, he approached the wagon and extended his hand to help Cordelia down. "Thank you," she said, accepting his assistance. Up close, she could smell leather and soap and something else, not cologne, but the clean scent of a man who worked hard but maintained his dignity. Jeremiah led her toward the house, his long strides forcing her to hurry to keep pace. As they climbed the front steps, Cordelia noticed that the porch was swept clean despite the constantly falling snow, and that the windows gleamed with recent washing. This was not a bachelor's rough dwelling, but a home maintained with care and attention to detail. Inside, the house was warm and surprisingly comfortable. The furniture was solid and well-made, chosen for durability rather than fashion, but it created an atmosphere of quiet prosperity. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, its hearth crackling with a fire that had been carefully tended. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes on everything from animal husbandry to territorial law. "Mrs. Patterson," Jeremiah called, and a sturdy woman in her 50s emerged from what was presumably the kitchen. She had graying hair pulled back in a sensible bun and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone accustomed to running a household efficiently. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "This is Cordelia Thorne," Jeremiah said simply. "She be staying here." Mrs. Patterson studied Cordelia with sharp eyes that missed nothing, not the worn fabric of her dress, not the careful way she held herself despite her obvious exhaustion, not the intelligence that flickered behind her guarded expression. "I've prepared the blue room upstairs. Dinner's at 6 sharp." "Thank you," Cordelia said. "Is there anything I should know about household routines?" "We'll discuss that tomorrow," Mrs. Patterson replied. "Tonight, you'll want a rest. Travel's hard on a person, and you look like you could use a good meal and a warm bed." Jeremiah disappeared into his office without another word, leaving Cordelia to follow Mrs. Patterson up a solid oak staircase to the second floor. The blue room was simple but comfortable, a bed with a thick quilt, a dresser with a mirror, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a window that looked out over the vast expanse of the ranch. "There's hot water in the kitchen if you want. T.O. wash up," Mrs. Patterson said. "And I laid out some clothes that might fit you better than what you're wearing. They belonged to Mr. Caldwell's sister. She visited a few years back and left some things behind." Alone in the room, Cordelia sank onto the edge of the bed and tried to process the dramatic change in her circumstances. This morning, she had been the daughter of a failed rancher, responsible for keeping a dying operation alive through sheer stubbornness and careful management of increasingly scarce resources. Tonight, she was what exactly? A purchased woman? A future wife? A ranch hand with indoor accommodations? She walked to the window and looked out at the buildings scattered across the valley floor. Even in the gathering dusk, she could see the evidence of prosperity and careful management: corrals with sturdy fencing, Barns with roofs that showed recent repair, and the orderly layout of a working ranch that had been planned rather than simply accumulated over time. The clothes Mrs. Patterson had left were indeed a better fit than her own worn dress, a simple but well-made skirt and blouse in dark blue wool that was both practical and flattering. The previous owner had been a woman of similar build, and Cordelia found herself wondering about Jeremiah's sister. What kind of woman was she? Why had she visited this remote ranch? And why had she left clothes behind as if she never intended to return? Dinner was served in a dining room that could have seated 12, but tonight accommodated only 3. Jeremiah sat at the head of the table, Mrs. Patterson to his right, and Cordelia across from the housekeeper. The meal was substantial: roast beef, potatoes, vegetables that had been carefully preserved from the summer garden, and bread that was clearly made fresh that day. "The cattle are in good condition for this time of year," Mrs. Patterson said, apparently continuing a conversation that had begun before Cordelia joined them. "Pete says the hay supply should last through March, even if we get another hard freeze." Jeremiah nodded, cutting his meat with precise movements. "The new bulls from Texas arrived last week. They're adjusting well to the altitude." Cordelia listened to this exchange with growing interest. It was clear that Mrs. Patterson was more than just a housekeeper. She was involved in the ranch's operations and served as Jeremiah's sounding board for business decisions. This was not a typical arrangement for most ranches, where women were expected to concern themselves only with domestic matters. "Miss Thorne," Mrs. Patterson said suddenly, turning her attention to their guest, "Pete mentioned you have experience with livestock management." "Some," Cordelia replied carefully. "I've been running my father's operation for the past 3 years. We had about 200 head before." She paused, then continued more firmly, "before the debts became unmanageable." "What did you do about feed costs?" Jeremiah asked, speaking. For the first time since they had sat down, Cordelia looked at him directly. "Negotiated contracts with 3 different suppliers to ensure competitive pricing. Calculated exactly how much we needed for the winter and bought it all in August when prices were lowest. Sold off the older breeding stock that weren't producing efficiently and used the money to improve the bloodlines of the remaining herd. And it still wasn't enough? It would have been, if my father hadn't been borrowing against future profits to cover his gambling losses." Cordelia's voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath. "A ranch can survive bad weather, market fluctuations, even disease if it's managed properly. It can't survive an owner who treats it like a personal bank account." Mrs. Patterson exchanged a glance with Jeremiah that Cordelia couldn't quite interpret. "What would you do differently if you were starting over?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Cordelia set down her fork and considered her answer carefully. This felt like a test, though she wasn't sure what the consequences of passing or failing might be. "I'd focus on sustainable growth instead of quick profits," she said finally. "Build up cash reserves before expanding the herd. Invest in infrastructure that would pay dividends over time: better fencing, improved breeding facilities, water management systems. And I'd keep detailed records of every transaction, every head of cattle, every expense, so I'd always know exactly where the operation stood financially." Jeremiah's pale eyes remained fixed on her face throughout her response. When she finished, he simply nodded once and returned to his dinner. But Cordelia had the distinct impression that she had just passed some kind of examination. After dinner, Mrs. Patterson retreated to the kitchen to clean up, leaving Cordelia and Jeremiah alone. In the dining room, the silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but filled with unspoken questions. Finally, Jeremiah stood and walked to one of the windows that faced west toward the mountains. "This ranch covers 47,000 acres, he said without turning around. "It takes 6 months to ride the full boundary, even on a good horse. I've got 237 people working for me, not counting seasonal hands. The operation generates more revenue than some entire towns. Cordelia waited, sensing that he was building towards something important. I built all of this from nothing, he continued. When I came to Montana, I had $12, a horse that was older than I was, and a head full of ideas that everyone said were impossible. They said the winters were too hard, the distances too great, the market too unreliable. They said a lot of things. He turned back toward her, and in the lamplight, his face looked younger than his years, but marked by the kind of experience that comes from making difficult decisions in isolation. I need someone who understands that success isn't about luck, or inheritance, or even hard work alone. It's about seeing possibilities that other people miss, and having the patience to build something that will last longer than yourself. He paused, studying her intently. Your father saw you as a burden to be disposed of. I see you as an investment with unlimited potential. Cordelia felt something shift inside her chest. Not gratitude exactly, but recognition. For the first time in years, someone was looking at her and seeing not a problem to be solved or a mouth to be fed, but a resource with genuine value. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Caldwell? Partnership, he said simply. Legal marriage. For the sake of appearances and property rights, but a business partnership in reality. You help me manage this operation, and in return, you get an equal share in everything we build together. And if the partnership doesn't work out, then you keep half of whatever we've accumulated during our collaboration, and you're free to start your own operation wherever you choose. It was, Cordelia realized, the most extraordinary offer she had ever received. Not because it promised wealth or security, though it did both, but because it treated her as an equal partner rather than a subordinate or dependent. I accept, she said without hesitation. Jeremiah smiled then, the first genuine expression of warmth she had seen from him. Good, we'll start tomorrow. There's a lot of work to do before spring, and I have a feeling you're going to revolutionize the way we do business around here. As Cordelia climbed the stairs to her room that night, she felt the weight of her old life falling away like snow shaken from a tree branch. Tomorrow she would begin building something entirely new, not as Cordelia Thorne, the failed rancher's unwanted daughter, but as an equal partner in an enterprise that stretched beyond the horizon. She had been sold for 3 bottles of whiskey, but she was about to buy herself a future that no amount of money could have purchased. Cordelia's first morning as Jeremiah Caldwell's partner began at 4:30 in the darkness before dawn, when Mrs. Patterson's firm knock penetrated the heavy sleep of exhaustion. The blue room felt foreign in the pre-dawn gloom, filled with shadows that seemed to whisper of the magnitude of what she had committed herself to the night before. Coffee's ready in the kitchen, Mrs. Patterson called through the door. Boss is already down at the South Barn to tell you the real education starts today. Cordelia dressed quickly in the practical clothes that had been left for her, sturdy boots, wool pants that belonged to one of the ranch hands, and a heavy coat that smelled faintly of leather and pine smoke. When she reached the kitchen, she found a steaming cup of coffee waiting alongside a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits that could have fed 2 people. Eat all of it, Mrs. Patterson instructed without looking up from the stove where she was preparing what appeared to be enough food to feed an army. You'll be working harder today than you have in your entire life, and there won't be time to stop for proper meals until evening. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, and the food was better than anything Cordelia had eaten in months. As she ate, Mrs. Patterson loaded items into a large basket. More food, a thermos of coffee, medical supplies, and various tools that Cordelia couldn't immediately identify. That's for the birthing barn, Mrs. Patterson explained, noticing her curiosity. We've got 17 cows expected to calve in the next 2 weeks. And Mr. Caldwell believes in being prepared for complications. Lost too many calves in his early years because he didn't have the right supplies on hand when things went wrong. The walk to the south barn took them through a landscape transformed by the pre-dawn light filtering through falling snow. What had appeared chaotic in yesterday's gathering dusk now revealed itself as a carefully orchestrated operation. Paths between buildings were clearly marked and kept clear of debris. Water troughs were positioned strategically to serve multiple corrals while remaining accessible for cleaning and maintenance. Even the manure piles were located downwind and at distances calculated to minimize odor while maximizing convenience for collection. Inside the south barn, Cordelia discovered that Jeremiah Caldwell's attention to detail extended far beyond basic ranch management. The interior was divided into individual stalls, each equipped with clean bedding, fresh water, and feeding systems designed for easy access and cleaning. Lanterns hung at regular intervals, providing adequate light without creating fire hazards. The air was warm, but not stifling, indicating a ventilation system that maintained optimal conditions without wasting heat. Jeremiah stood in the center aisle, examining a massive Hereford cow whose swollen sides indicated imminent delivery. He looked up as Cordelia approached, and she could see that he had been awake for some time. His hair was damp with melted snow, and his boots showed evidence of having already made rounds through multiple barns. "This is Duchess," he said, running his hand along the cow's flank with practiced gentleness. "Best breeding cow I've ever owned. She's produced 8 calves in 6 years, and every one of them survived to maturity. But she's having trouble this time." Cordelia moved closer, studying the animal with eyes trained by years of practical experience. Duchess was indeed in distress. Her breathing was labored, her movements restless, and there was a quality to her demeanor that suggested complications beyond normal birthing difficulties. "How long has she been in labor?" Cordelia asked. "Since midnight. Pete found her when he made his 2 o'clock rounds." Jeremiah's voice carried the weight of genuine concern. "I've been checking on her every hour since then, but she's not progressing like she should." Cordelia knelt beside the cow, examining her more closely. What she saw confirmed her suspicions. Duchess was trying to deliver a calf that was positioned incorrectly, a situation that could kill both mother and baby if not corrected quickly. "The calf's breached," she said, standing and rolling up her sleeves. "I can fix this, but I'll need hot water, clean towels, and that bottle of carbolic acid I saw Mrs. Patterson packing in the medical supplies." Jeremiah studied her for a moment, then nodded. "What do you need me to do?" For the next 2 hours, Cordelia worked with a skill and confidence that surprised even herself. She had assisted with difficult births before, but never under such scrutiny and never with so much at stake. Jeremiah proved to be an ideal assistant, anticipating her needs, following instructions without question, and maintaining the calm demeanor that kept both the cow and the surrounding animals from becoming agitated. When the calf finally emerged, alive, healthy, and already attempting to stand, Cordelia felt a rush of satisfaction that had nothing to do with proving herself, and everything to do with the simple joy of bringing life into the world successfully. "Well done," Jeremiah said, and the approval in his voice was worth more than any payment she had ever received. They moved through the rest of the morning, examining cattle in various stages of pregnancy, checking feed supplies, and reviewing the detailed records that Jeremiah kept on every animal in his care. Cordelia quickly realized that the Silent Baron's reputation for strategic thinking extended to every aspect of his operation. Each cow was tracked individually, breeding dates, health history, offspring records, and productivity measures were all meticulously documented in ledgers that would have impressed a bank president. "Most ranchers treat their cattle like interchangeable units," Jeremiah explained as they examined the breeding records for his prize bulls. "They buy cheap stock, hope for the best, and accept whatever losses come their way. I treat each animal as an individual investment with specific potential for return." The numbers told a compelling story. while neighboring ranches typically lost 15 to 20% of their calves each year to disease, predation, or birthing complications. Jeremy's operation maintained a survival rate of over 95%. His cattle reached market weight faster than industry averages, commanded premium prices due to their quality, and produced offspring that were sought after by ranchers from Texas to Oregon. How did you learn to keep such detailed records? Cordelia asked as they reviewed the financial projections for the coming year. Trial and error mostly. And books. Jeremy gestured toward a shelf lined with volumes on animal husbandry, veterinary medicine, and agricultural economics. Spent my first winter in Montana reading everything I could get my hands on about successful ranching operations. Then, I started experimenting with different approaches until I found what worked. The afternoon brought a tour of the horse operation, which proved to be as impressive as the cattle enterprise. Jeremy raised working horses specifically bred for ranch conditions, animals that could work cattle, navigate difficult terrain, and survive harsh weather while maintaining the stamina needed for long days in the saddle. His breeding program focused on combining the intelligence and agility of quarter horses with the endurance and hardiness of Mustang stock. "Horses are like people," he said as they watched a group of young colts playing in a snow-covered paddock. "Give them good breeding, proper training, and respect their individual personalities, and they'll work with you for life. Treat them like machinery, and they'll break down when you need them most." Cordelia found herself constantly impressed by the depth of Jeremy's knowledge and the sophistication of his operation. This was not a man who had stumbled into success through luck or inherited wealth. Every decision showed evidence of careful thought, long-term planning, and deep understanding of the complex relationships between animal welfare, environmental conditions, and economic reality. As the day progressed, she began to understand why Jeremy had been willing to gamble on her potential rather than simply hiring another ranch hand. The complexity of his operation required someone who could think strategically, adapt to changing conditions, and make independent decisions that aligned with long-term objectives. He needed a true partner, not just an employee. Their final stop was the main office, located in a building separate from the house, but connected by a covered walkway that allowed access during severe weather. The office contained the nerve center of the entire operation, detailed maps showing every acre of the ranch, weather records dating back 15 years, market reports from cattle centers across the country, and correspondence with buyers, suppliers, and government officials. "This is where the real work happens," Jeremy said, settling behind a desk covered with ledgers, letters, and reports. "Raising cattle is the easy part. The challenge is anticipating market conditions, managing cash flow, negotiating contracts, and staying ahead of regulations that change faster than the weather." Cordelia studied the maps with growing amazement. The ranch was even larger than she had imagined, encompassing not just grazing land but timber forests, mineral deposits, and water rights that extended far beyond the immediate operational needs. This was not just a cattle ranch but a diversified enterprise positioned to take advantage of multiple opportunities as the territory developed. "You own all of this?" "Own, lease, or hold development rights to," Jeremy corrected. "The key is controlling resources that other people need. Cattle are profitable, but land appreciation and resource development are where real wealth gets built." He showed her contracts with mining companies who paid substantial fees for access to mineral deposits on his land, agreements with lumber operations that harvested timber under carefully managed sustainable practices, and water rights that were becoming increasingly valuable as more settlers arrived in the territory. "Most ranchers think small," he continued. "They focus on this year's calf crop and next year's grass conditions. But real success comes from thinking in decades, not seasons. Everything I do today is designed to position this operation to take advantage of opportunities that won't fully develop for another 10 or 20 years. The scope of his vision was breathtaking. Jeremiah had clearly studied the patterns of Western development and positioned himself to benefit from every stage of territorial growth. As railroads expanded, his land would increase in value. As mining operations grew, his resource rights would become more profitable. As population increased, his diversified holdings would provide multiple revenue streams that would continue growing long after cattle prices fluctuated. "Where do I fit into all of this?" Cordelia asked. Jeremiah leaned back in his chair and studied her with those pale eyes that seemed to see straight through to her thoughts. "You understand numbers, you think strategically, and you're not afraid of hard work. But more importantly, you're not intimidated by the scope of what we're building here. Most people look at an operation like this and see only the complexity and risk. You look at it and see the possibilities." He pulled out a leather portfolio and opened it to reveal architectural drawings for a series of buildings that didn't yet exist. "Next spring, we're breaking ground on a new processing facility that will allow us to add value to our cattle before they go to market. Instead of selling live animals to middlemen who take most of the profit, we'll be producing finished beef products and selling directly to restaurants and markets in Denver, Salt Lake City, and eventually San Francisco." The drawing showed a sophisticated operation: slaughterhouses, processing facilities, cold storage buildings, and even a small railroad siding that would allow direct shipping to distant markets. The projected revenues were staggering, potentially tripling the ranch's income within 5 years. "This is what I need a real partner for," Jeremiah continued. "Someone who can manage the day-to-day operations while I focus on expansion and development. Someone who can make decisions without constantly needing approval or guidance. Someone who understands that we're not just raising cattle, we're building an empire." Cordelia studied the drawings with growing excitement. This was exactly the kind of visionary thinking that she had always believed was possible, but had never had the resources to attempt. Working with someone who thought on this scale would be like finally having access to tools that matched her ambitions. "When do we start construction?" "As soon as the ground thaws. But the real work starts now. Finalizing designs, securing materials, negotiating labor contracts, and coordinating with the railroad to ensure we have shipping capacity when we need it." They spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing the detailed plans for the expansion, discussing logistics, identifying potential problems, and refining timelines. Cordelia found herself contributing ideas and suggestions that Jeremiah incorporated immediately, treating her input as valuable rather than merely tolerated. As darkness fell, and they finally returned to the main house for dinner, Cordelia realized that she had not thought about her old life even once during the entire day. The transformation from Thomas Thorne's burden to Jeremiah Caldwell's partner had been so complete that it felt like awakening from a long, difficult dream. Mrs. Patterson had prepared another substantial meal, but the atmosphere at dinner was different from the night before. Instead of careful introductions and tentative conversation, they discussed plans, shared observations from the day's work, and debated strategies for the coming expansion with the easy familiarity of people who had found common ground. "The processing facility will need its own water supply," Mrs. Patterson observed as they discussed the construction timeline. "That means either drilling new wells or extending the current system." "We'll drill new wells," Jeremiah decided. "I don't want to risk contaminating the water supply for the livestock or the household." "Cordelia, what do you think about the location they've proposed for the slaughterhouse?" The fact that he asked for her opinion as naturally as he might consult a longtime business partner was not lost on Cordelia. In less than 24 hours, she had gone from being property to be disposed of to being a respected voice in planning. An enterprise that would reshape the entire region. "It's positioned well for efficiency," she said, referring to the drawings they had studied. "Close enough to the main corrals for easy transport of cattle, but far enough from the residential areas to avoid conflicts with odor or noise." The proximity to the railroad siding is perfect for shipping, and there's room for expansion if demand grows faster than anticipated. My thoughts exactly, Jeremiah agreed. We'll finalize those plans tomorrow and start placing orders for materials that need to be shipped before winter ends. After dinner, Cordelia found herself alone with Jeremiah in his study, surrounded by books, maps, and documents that represented 15 years of careful planning and strategic thinking. A fire crackled in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with the accumulated knowledge that had built an empire. "I have a confession to make," Jeremiah said as he poured himself a glass of whiskey from a crystal decanter. "I didn't buy you on impulse yesterday. I've been watching your father's operation for months, and I've been impressed by how well you managed it despite his interference." Cordelia felt a flush of surprise and something that might have been pride. "You knew about me before yesterday?" "I make it my business to know about everyone in this territory who demonstrates exceptional ability. Your reputation for turning around failing ranches preceded you." He offered her a glass, which she accepted. "When I heard that your father was gambling heavily and likely to lose everything, I saw an opportunity to acquire someone whose talents were being wasted. So the card game was arranged? Let's say that your father's debts were carefully managed to ensure that when he finally gambled away his last asset, I would be in a position to acquire it." Jeremiah's smile was slightly predatory but not unkind. "I've built this empire by recognizing value that other people overlook and positioning myself to acquire it when circumstances are favorable." Cordelia sipped the whiskey, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. "And you saw value in me that my own father missed." "Your father saw a burden. I saw the most capable ranch manager in 3 territories who happened to be trapped in circumstances that prevented her from demonstrating her full potential." Jeremiah raised his glass in a small salute. "To recognize opportunities that others miss, to partnerships that benefit everyone involved," Cordelia replied, clinking her glass against his dot as she climbed the stairs to her room that night. Cordelia reflected on the extraordinary day that had just ended. She had assisted with a difficult birth, learned the intricacies of a sophisticated business operation, contributed to planning a major expansion, and discovered that her new partner had specifically sought her out, because of her abilities rather than simply accepting her as part of a transaction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself, and new steps toward building something that would outlast them both. But tonight, for the first time in years, Cordelia Thorne fell asleep knowing that she was exactly where she belonged, not as someone else's burden or property, but as an equal partner in an enterprise limited only by their combined vision and determination. The whiskey bottles that had purchased her freedom were already empty, discarded remnants of a transaction that had seemed like an ending but was actually a beginning. And in the morning, the real work of building an empire would continue. The first challenge to Cordelia's new position came not from nature or business complications, but from men who refused to believe that a woman purchased for whiskey could possess any authority worth recognizing. It arrived on a bitter February morning in the form of Marcus Brennan, Jeremiah's foreman for the past 8 years, leading a delegation of senior ranch hands who had requested a meeting with the boss. Cordelia was in the main office reviewing supplier contracts when she heard the commotion outside, the heavy footsteps of multiple men, the jingle of spurs, and voices raised in heated discussion. Through the frost-covered window, she could see 6 men clustered near the office entrance, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air as they gestured emphatically among themselves. Jeremiah emerged from the back room where he had been studying architectural drawings for the processing facility. His face showed no emotion, but Cordelia had learned to recognize the subtle signs of his displeasure, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his hands became perfectly still, the quality of silence that preceded his most decisive actions. "Let them in," he said simply. Marcus Brennan entered first, removing his hat in a gesture that was respectful, but somehow managed to convey challenge rather than deference. He was a weathered man in his 40s, built like a tree trunk and possessing the kind of natural authority that came from years of making life and death decisions in harsh conditions. Behind him filed the other senior hands, Pete Hawkins, who had driven Cordelia from town, Sam Morrison, the head wrangler, Jake Sullivan, who managed the horse breeding program, and two others whose names Cordelia had not yet learned, but whose skeptical expressions she recognized immediately. "Boss," Marcus began, his voice carefully controlled, "we need to discuss the new arrangements around here." Jeremiah said nothing, simply gestured toward the chairs arranged around his desk. The men remained standing, a choice that struck Cordelia as both stubborn and strategically unwise. In her experience, people who refused to sit during difficult conversations usually ended up regretting the decision. "It's about Miss Thorne," Marcus continued, glancing briefly in Cordelia's direction before returning his attention to Jeremiah. "Don't get me wrong. She seems like a capable woman, and we all saw how she handled Duchess's birthing trouble. But the boys are having a hard time understanding why someone who just arrived is suddenly involved in decisions that affect everyone's livelihood, specifically." Jeremiah's voice was quiet, but Cordelia heard the danger underneath. Sam Morrison stepped forward, his hat in his hands, but his jaw set in determination. "Yesterday she changed the feeding schedule for the pregnant cows without consulting anyone. This morning she ordered modifications to the birthing stalls that'll cost time and materials we hadn't budgeted for. And Pete says she's been asking questions about our contracts with the feed suppliers. All decisions made with my approval," Jeremiah said, still speaking quietly. "Is there a problem with following orders?" The men exchanged glances, and Cordelia realized that they had elected Marcus as their spokesman because he was the only one with enough seniority and respect to challenge Jeremiah directly without risking immediate dismissal. "The problem," Marcus said carefully, "is that we don't understand the chain of command anymore. Are we taking orders from Miss Thorne now? Does she have authority to make changes to operations we've been running successfully for years? And if so, what happens to the men who've been loyal to this ranch since before she arrived?" The room fell silent except for the whisper of wind around the building's eaves and the distant sound of cattle moving through the corrals. Cordelia felt the weight of 6 pairs of eyes studying her, measuring her response to what was clearly a test of both her authority and her character. She stood slowly, setting down the contract she had been reviewing, and walked to the large map of the ranch that dominated one wall. When she turned back to face the room, her voice was calm, but carried an edge that surprised even her. "Mr. Morrison, you're concerned about the feeding schedule. Can you tell me what the current mortality rate is for calves born during the winter months?" Sam shifted uncomfortably. "About what you'd expect for this time of year. Maybe 12–15%. The modifications I ordered for the birthing stalls are based on veterinary practices that have reduced winter mortality to less than 5% on ranches in Colorado and Wyoming." Cordelia gestured toward a stack of agricultural journals on Jeremiah's desk. "The feeding schedule changes are designed to ensure optimal nutrition during the final weeks of pregnancy, when proper development can mean the difference between a healthy calf and one that doesn't survive its first week." She moved to another table where financial records were spread out in neat rows. "As for the feed supplier contracts, I've identified opportunities to reduce costs by 20% while improving nutritional quality. The savings from those negotiations will more than cover the cost of the stall modifications and pay for additional improvements that will benefit everyone working here." Marcus frowned, clearly not expecting such detailed responses. "That's all well and good, but the fact remains that you're making changes to operations that have been working fine for years. Working fine is not the same as working optimally," Cordelia replied. Mr. Caldwell built this ranch by constantly improving and adapting. Standing still is the same as moving backward, especially when competitors are advancing. She walked back to the map and pointed to several marked locations. The processing facility that breaks ground this spring will revolutionize this operations. Profitability. But it will also require higher standards of quality and consistency than we've needed before. Every improvement we make now is preparation for that larger transformation. Pete Hawkins spoke up for the first time. What about the men who've been doing things the old way? Are we all going to be replaced by new methods and new people? The men who adapt and grow will be promoted to positions of greater responsibility and higher pay, Cordelia said without hesitation. The men who refuse to learn will be replaced by others who are willing to embrace progress. That's not a threat. It's simply the reality of business. She paused, studying each face in turn. Mr. Caldwell didn't build this empire by accepting good enough. He built it by demanding excellence and rewarding people who delivered it. I intend to continue that tradition. Jeremiah, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. Miss Thorne is my partner in this operation. Her authority is equal to mine, and her decisions carry the same weight as if I had made them myself. Any man who has a problem with that arrangement is free to collect his pay and find employment elsewhere. The finality in his voice left no room for argument, but Cordelia could see that the underlying tensions had not been resolved. Respect could not be commanded. It had to be earned through demonstrated competence and consistent results. I understand your concerns, she said, addressing the group directly. Change is difficult, especially when it affects routines that have served you well, but I'm not here to destroy what works. I'm here to build on the foundation you've already created and help make it even stronger. She walked to Jeremiah's desk and picked up a thick folder filled with financial projections. The processing facility will create new jobs that pay better than traditional ranch work. The efficiency improvements we're implementing will generate profits that can be shared with everyone who contributes to the success. And the knowledge you gain from working with advanced methods will make you more valuable whether you stay here or decide to start your own operation someday. Jake Sullivan, who had been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke. What kind of new jobs? Cordelia opened the folder and spread out several documents. Equipment operators for the processing machinery, quality control supervisors, transportation coordinators, administrative positions that require people who understand both ranching and business operations. Within 5 years, this ranch will employ twice as many people at wages that are substantially higher than industry standards. She could see the shift in their expressions as they began to understand that the changes she proposed might benefit them rather than threaten their livelihoods. Fear of the unknown was giving way to curiosity about new possibilities. The key, she continued, is proving that we can trust each other. You need to see that I know what I'm doing and that my decisions will improve your working conditions and prospects. I need to see that you're willing to learn new methods and adapt to changing requirements. We all need to work together to make this transition successful. Marcus studied the financial projections with obvious interest. These numbers are real? The profit projections, the job creation estimates? Conservative, if anything, Jeremiah answered. The demand for high quality beef products is growing faster than supply in every major city west of Chicago. We're positioning ourselves to capture a significant share of that market. The meeting continued for another hour as Cordelia explained her plans in detail, answered specific questions about implementation timelines, and addressed concerns about how the changes would affect daily operations. By the time the men filed out of the office, the atmosphere had shifted from confrontation to cautious cooperation. Well handled, Jeremiah said after they were alone. But you realize this is just the beginning. Proving yourself to 6 men is easier than proving yourself to an entire community that's watching to see if a woman can really manage a business empire. I'm aware of the challenges, Cordelia replied. But I've been underestimated my entire life. It's actually an advantage. People don't see me coming until I've already succeeded. The truth of that statement became apparent over the following weeks as Cordelia systematically implemented changes that transformed the ranch's efficiency. While building relationships with key personnel, she worked alongside the hands during difficult births, demonstrated the effectiveness of her new feeding protocols by achieving measurably better results, and proved that her cost-saving negotiations with suppliers actually delivered the promised benefits. More importantly, she began expanding the scope of the operation in ways that Jeremiah had never considered. Using her literacy and mathematical skills, she initiated correspondence with buyers in distant markets, negotiated contracts that guaranteed higher prices for premium cattle, and established relationships with suppliers who could provide materials for the processing facility at substantial discounts. How did you know to contact the restaurant consortium in San Francisco? Jeremiah asked one evening as they reviewed the week's correspondence. I read in one of the trade journals that California's population is growing by 30% annually, and most of the new residents are accustomed to higher quality food than what's currently available locally, Cordelia explained. I wrote to the largest restaurants and offered to provide them with guaranteed supplies of premium beef at prices lower than they're currently paying for inferior products. She showed him the responses that had arrived that day, agreements in principle from 12 establishments that wanted to establish ongoing supply relationships, requests for product samples from 6 others, and inquiries about expanded services from restaurant owners who were impressed by the professionalism of her correspondence. This changes everything, Jeremiah said, studying the contracts. Instead of selling to middlemen who set their own prices, we'll be dealing directly with end users who are willing to pay premium rates for consistent quality. It gets better, Cordelia said, pulling out another folder. I've been corresponding with railroad officials about establishing a dedicated refrigerated shipping service. If we can guarantee regular shipments of sufficient volume, they'll provide specialized cars that will maintain product quality during transport and allow us to reach markets as far away as Portland and Seattle. The scope of the transformation was breathtaking. What had begun as a cattle ranch was evolving into a vertically integrated food production and distribution company with the potential to dominate regional markets across the entire western United States. Where did you learn to think on this scale? Jeremiah asked. From you, Cordelia replied. You taught me that success comes from seeing possibilities that other people miss. I'm just applying that principle to markets and opportunities you hadn't had time to explore yet. As winter gradually gave way to spring, the pace of change accelerated. Construction crews arrived to begin work on the processing facility. New equipment was delivered and assembled under Cordelia's supervision. Contracts were finalized with distant buyers who were eager to establish reliable supply relationships. And the ranch's cattle operation continued to achieve record-breaking results under the new management protocols. But the most significant change was in Cordelia herself. The woman who had arrived as purchased property was disappearing, replaced by someone who moved through the world with the confidence of a person who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to demand recognition for her contributions. She appeared at community meetings where ranchers discussed shared concerns about markets, weather, and government regulations. Her opinions were initially dismissed, then grudgingly acknowledged, and finally actively sought by men who discovered that her insights consistently proved valuable. She negotiated with suppliers, corresponded with buyers, and made decisions that affected hundreds of people's livelihoods with the natural authority of someone born to leadership. The territorial governor wants to meet with you, Jeremiah announced. One morning in early April, as they reviewed progress reports from the construction crews. Apparently word has reached the capital about what we're building here, and he's interested in discussing how our operation might serve as a model for economic development throughout the territory. Cordelia looked up from the shipping schedules she had been coordinating. What kind of meeting? The kind where important people ask your opinions about policy decisions that affect thousands of settlers and millions of dollars in economic activity. Jeremir's smile carried a hint of pride. Congratulations, partner. You've officially become someone whose thoughts matter to people who shape the future of this region. As Cordelia prepared for her journey to the territorial capital, she reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in just a few months. She had gone from being a burden her father couldn't afford to being a business leader, whose opinions were sought by government officials. She had evolved from someone who managed a failing ranch to someone who was building a commercial empire that would reshape entire markets. But perhaps most importantly, she had discovered that the woman she was becoming had always existed inside her, waiting for circumstances that would allow her true capabilities to emerge. The whiskey bottles that had purchased her freedom were long forgotten, buried beneath achievements that no amount of alcohol could ever have bought. The territorial capital of Helena buzzed with the energy of a frontier town transforming itself into a center of real political power. When Cordelia's carriage rolled through the muddy streets in late April, she observed a community caught between its rough mining camp origins and its ambitious aspirations for statehood. Wooden shacks stood beside brick buildings under construction, saloons neighboring banks, and the constant sound of hammering echoed from every direction as the town rebuilt itself in stone and permanence. Governor Samuel Richardson received her in his office on the second floor of the new territorial building, an imposing structure that spoke of Montana's determination to be taken seriously by Washington politicians who still viewed the Western territories as temporary inconveniences rather than future states. Richardson himself was a compact man in his 50s, with shrewd eyes and the careful manner of someone who had learned to navigate between competing interests without making unnecessary enemies. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, rising from behind a desk covered with maps, reports, and correspondence that suggested the complexity of governing a territory larger than most eastern states. "I appreciate you making this journey. Your reputation has preceded you considerably." "Governor Richardson," Cordelia replied, accepting his offer of a chair positioned to face both his desk and a large map of Montana territory that dominated the eastern wall. "I'm curious what aspects of our operation have drawn your attention." Richardson settled back in his chair and studied her with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to measuring people's potential usefulness. "Several aspects. Actually, the processing facility you're constructing represents the largest private investment in food production infrastructure in the territory's history. Your supply contracts extend our economic reach to markets that have never been accessible to Montana producers. And your methods of integrating ranching, processing, and distribution could serve as a model for development throughout the region." He gestured toward the map, where colored pins marked various locations across the territory. "We're facing a critical decision point regarding statehood. Congress is willing to consider our application, but they want evidence that we can sustain a diversified economy beyond mining and basic agriculture. Your operation demonstrates exactly the kind of sophisticated commercial development that could tip the balance in our favor." Cordelia studied the map more closely, noting the strategic placement of pins that obviously represented significant economic or political assets. "What specific role do you envision for our operation in supporting statehood?" "Demonstration and expansion," Richardson answered immediately. "We want to showcase your facility to a congressional delegation that's visiting this summer. More importantly, we want to discuss how your model could be replicated in other regions to create a network of processing and distribution centers that would make Montana a major supplier to Western markets." The governor pulled out a folder thick with documents and spread several across his desk. We're prepared to offer substantial incentives for operations that meet certain criteria, land grants for facility construction, reduced taxes for companies that employ specified numbers of workers, preferential treatment for government contracts, and assistance with transportation infrastructure development. Cordelia examined the documents with growing interest. The incentives were indeed substantial, potentially worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to qualifying operations. But she also recognized the political calculation underlying the offer. Success in building a network of advanced facilities would strengthen Montana's case for statehood, while creating economic opportunities that would benefit Richardson's political career. These incentives apply to expansion beyond our current operation? Absolutely. We're particularly interested in facilities located in different regions of the territory: the Flathead Valley for timber processing integration, the Judith Basin for grain production coordination, areas near the Yellowstone River for transportation advantages. Richardson leaned forward, his enthusiasm becoming more apparent. Imagine a network of facilities that could process not just beef, but pork, grain products, timber, and even mining byproducts into finished goods ready for shipment to any market in the West. The vision was ambitious and appealing, but Cordelia's business instincts warned her to examine the proposal carefully before making commitments. Large-scale expansion would require enormous investments of capital, time, and management attention. Success would bring tremendous profits and influence, but failure could destroy everything she and Jeremiah had built. What would be required from us in terms of timeline and investment? Richardson shuffled through his papers and produced a detailed timeline. Ideally, we'd like to see construction begin on at least 2 additional facilities before the congressional visit in August. Full operations by next spring would demonstrate our capacity for rapid development and position us favorably for statehood consideration. Cordelia studied the timeline with growing concern. The schedule was aggressive to the point of being potentially unrealistic, especially given the complexity of coordinating construction, equipment procurement, labor recruitment, and operational startup across multiple locations. Attempting to move too quickly could result in cost overruns, quality problems, and operational failures that would damage their reputation and financial position. Governor, I appreciate the opportunity and the potential benefits, but this timeline concerns me. Quality operations require careful planning and systematic implementation. Rushing to meet political deadlines could compromise the very success that makes this proposal attractive. Richardson's expression tightened slightly. Mrs. Caldwell, opportunities like this don't arise frequently. The political window for statehood may not remain open indefinitely, and the economic advantages we're offering won't be available once other operations begin competing for the same incentives. I understand the urgency, Cordelia replied carefully. But I also understand that failed ventures hurt everyone involved, politically, economically, and personally. Perhaps we could discuss a more realistic timeline that balances political needs with operational requirements. The negotiation continued for 2 hours as they worked through various scenarios, exploring possibilities for partial implementation, phased development, and alternative demonstration strategies. Cordelia found herself impressed by Richardson's knowledge of territorial economics and his genuine commitment to Montana's development, but she remained firm about maintaining standards that would ensure long-term success rather than short-term political gains. What if we committed to breaking ground on 1 additional facility by July, with full operations by the following spring? She proposed. We could provide detailed plans and financial projections for subsequent expansions, along with commitments to proceed based on the success of the pilot program. Richardson considered this compromise while studying maps that showed potential locations for the additional facility. The Judith Basin location would be ideal for the congressional demonstration. It's accessible by rail, represents a different geographical region from your current operation, and could showcase integration with grain production that would appeal to agricultural interests in Congress. The Judith Basin facility it is then. Cordelia extended her hand to seal the agreement. Subject, of course, to final approval from my partner and detailed analysis of the specific site and market conditions. As she prepared to leave Helena. The following morning, Cordelia reflected on the magnitude of what she had just committed to undertake. Expanding their operation to include a second major facility would test every aspect of her business capabilities and require management skills she had never been forced to develop. But it would also position her as one of the most influential business leaders in the territory, with direct access to political power and economic opportunities that few people ever experienced. The journey back to the ranch provided time to develop implementation strategies and anticipate the challenges that would arise from rapid expansion. By the time her carriage reached familiar territory, she had outlined approaches to financing, construction management, labor recruitment, and operational coordination that would allow them to meet their commitments while maintaining the quality standards that had made their success possible. Jeremiah was waiting in the main office when she arrived, surrounded by reports, correspondence, and financial documents that suggested he had used her absence to advance several other aspects of their operation. His greeting was characteristically brief, but carried undertones of both welcome and curiosity about the results of her meeting. How did it go with the governor? Cordelia settled into the chair across from his desk and began spreading out the documents she had brought back from Helena. We have an opportunity to become the foundation for Montana's statehood economy. We also have an opportunity to expand too quickly and destroy everything we've built. The challenge is distinguishing between the two. She explained the governor's proposal in detail, outlining both the potential benefits and the risks associated with aggressive expansion. Jeremiah listened without interruption, but she could see him calculating costs, timelines, and resource requirements as she spoke. The Judith Basin location has advantages, he said when she finished. Good rail access, proximity to grain production, available labor from seasonal agricultural workers. But the timeline is challenging. Challenging but not impossible, if we approach it systematically. Cordelia pulled out the implementation plan she had developed during her return journey. We'll need to recruit an experienced construction foreman, establish relationships with suppliers who can guarantee delivery schedules, and develop operational procedures that can be replicated at multiple locations. They spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing every aspect of the expansion plan, identifying potential problems, developing contingency strategies, and calculating the financial requirements for success. The numbers were substantial but manageable, assuming they could maintain current profit levels while investing in growth. There's another consideration, Jeremiah said as they concluded their planning session. Success with this expansion will make us major players in territorial politics. That brings opportunities, but it also brings scrutiny and potential conflicts that we haven't had to deal with before. What kind of conflicts? Competing ranchers who don't appreciate our success. Politicians who want to use our influence for their own purposes. Federal officials who might view our rapid growth as potentially problematic. Jeremiah leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Power attracts both allies and enemies, often in equal measure. The truth of his observation became apparent within days of beginning preparation for the Judith Basin expansion. Word of their government contract spread quickly through the ranching community, generating reactions that ranged from congratulation to barely concealed resentment. Some neighboring ranchers requested meetings to discuss potential collaboration or supply relationships. Others began spreading rumors about unfair government favoritism and questioning whether such rapid expansion was sustainable. More significantly, Cordelia began receiving visitors who had never shown interest in her opinions before, territorial legislators seeking her views on proposed regulations, business leaders requesting advice on development strategies, and representatives from Eastern investment firms who had heard about Montana's economic potential and wanted to explore opportunities for involvement. "Mrs. Caldwell," announced James Whitfield, a well-dressed man who appeared at their office one morning without appointment or introduction. "I represent a consortium of Chicago investors who are very interested in Montana's agricultural development potential. We'd like to discuss possible partnerships or investment opportunities." Cordelia studied Whitfield with the wariness she had learned to apply to unexpected offers that seemed too generous to be legitimate. His clothes were expensive, his manner was polished, and his approach suggested the kind of confidence that came from access to substantial financial resources. But something about his presentation felt calculated rather than genuine. "What specific opportunities interest your consortium, Mr. Whitfield?" "Expansion capital for operations like yours." "Primarily. We understand you're planning significant growth, and we have the resources to accelerate that development considerably." Whitfield produced a leather portfolio filled with financial documents. "We're prepared to provide funding for multiple facility construction, equipment procurement, and operational startup costs in exchange for partnership agreements that would benefit everyone involved." The terms he outlined were indeed generous: immediate access to capital that would eliminate financing constraints, connections to Eastern markets that could dramatically increase their customer base, and management expertise from investors who had successfully developed similar operations in other regions. But Cordelia noticed that the partnership structures would also give outside investors significant control over operational decisions and strategic direction. "I appreciate the interest," she replied carefully, "but we're not currently seeking outside investment. Our expansion plans are adequately funded through existing resources and government incentives." Whitfield's smile became more insistent. "Mrs. Caldwell, with respect, the scale of development that Montana requires exceeds what any single operation can accomplish independently. Partnership with established Eastern investors isn't just an opportunity, it's a necessity for anyone serious about long-term success." "Perhaps for some operations," Cordelia agreed. "But we've built our success on maintaining complete control over quality, timing, and strategic direction. Sharing that control, even with well-intentioned partners, could compromise the very factors that have made us successful." The conversation continued for another hour as Whitfield presented increasingly attractive terms, and Cordelia politely but firmly maintained her position. By the time he left, she was convinced that accepting outside investment would fundamentally alter the character of their operation in ways that might ultimately prove more costly than beneficial. "Eastern money always comes with Eastern expectations," Jeremiah observed when she described the meeting. "They'll want quarterly profits, standardized procedures, and decision-making processes that prioritize immediate returns over long-term development." "Exactly my concern," Cordelia agreed. "We're building something that will last for generations. They're looking for returns that justify their investment within a few years. Those objectives aren't necessarily compatible." As spring progressed into summer, the pace of activity accelerated dramatically. Construction crews broke ground on the Judith Basin facility while completing final work on their original processing plant. Equipment arrived from manufacturers across the country and was installed under Cordelia's direct supervision. New employees were recruited and trained in procedures that would ensure consistent quality across multiple locations. Most importantly, Cordelia found herself increasingly recognized as a significant voice in territorial affairs. Her opinions were quoted in Helena newspapers, her business methods were studied by other entrepreneurs, and her support was sought by politicians preparing for the challenges of statehood. The transformation from purchased bride to territorial influence was nearly complete, but the most significant tests of her leadership still lay ahead. The congressional delegation arrived in Montana on July 15th aboard a specially chartered train. that gleamed with polished brass and carried politicians whose decisions would determine whether Montana became a state or remained a territorial afterthought. Cordelia watched from the platform in Helena as 7 congressmen, 4 senators, and a collection of aides and journalists disembarked into the summer heat, their Eastern clothes and careful mannerisms marking them as visitors to a world they didn't quite understand. Senator William Crawford from Massachusetts emerged last, a tall man with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to deference. He surveyed the crowd of territorial officials and local dignitaries with eyes that seemed to catalog everything for future political use. When Governor Richardson introduced Cordelia as one of our territory's most innovative business leaders, Crawford's handshake was firm, but his expression suggested skepticism about what a frontier woman could possibly teach seasoned Washington politicians. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, his voice carrying the precise diction of Eastern education. "Governor Richardson speaks highly of your enterprise. I confess, I'm curious to see what passes for advanced business practices in such remote circumstances." "Senator Crawford," Cordelia replied, matching his formality while allowing just a hint of steel to enter her voice. "I'm equally curious to see whether Washington's representatives can recognize innovation when it doesn't conform to their preconceptions about Western capabilities." The slight widening of Crawford's eyes suggested he had not expected such directness from a territorial business owner. Beside him, Congressman Robert Hayes from Ohio leaned forward with obvious interest, apparently intrigued by the prospect of unexpected developments during what he had probably assumed would be a routine fact-finding mission. The 3-day tour began with visits to Helena's government buildings, mineral processing facilities, and commercial establishments that demonstrated Montana's transition from mining camp to legitimate territorial capital. Cordelia observed the delegation's reactions carefully, noting which representatives seemed genuinely interested in Montana's potential versus those who appeared to be going through the motions of a politically necessary but personally inconvenient obligation. The real test came on the 2nd day when the delegation traveled to the Judith Basin facility for the demonstration that would make or break Montana's statehood application. The new processing plant was operating at full capacity, transforming live cattle into finished products with efficiency that impressed even the skeptical Eastern visitors. Cordelia guided them through each stage of the operation, explaining innovations that reduced waste, improved quality, and created value-added products that commanded premium prices in distant markets. "This level of integration is remarkable," admitted Congressman Hayes as they watched cattle being processed into cuts destined for restaurants in San Francisco and Portland. "Most Eastern operations handle only single stages of production. You've created a complete supply chain that controls quality from ranch to final delivery." "Integration provides multiple advantages," Cordelia explained, leading them to the shipping facility where refrigerated rail cars waited to transport products to Western markets. "We can guarantee consistent quality because we control every step of production. We can respond quickly to market changes because we're not dependent on outside suppliers or processors. And we can capture profits at every stage instead of allowing middlemen to extract value from our work." Senator Crawford studied the financial reports that documented the facility's performance with obvious surprise. "These profit margins exceed what most Eastern operations achieve, even with established market advantages and transportation efficiencies. Superior methods produce superior results," Cordelia replied. "We've invested in equipment, training, and procedures that maximize efficiency while maintaining quality standards that allow us to command premium prices." The delegation spent hours examining every aspect of the operation, asking detailed questions about costs, capacity, market relationships, and expansion potential. Several representatives took extensive notes, while others peppered Cordelia with inquiries about whether similar facilities could be developed in other regions and how quickly such expansion might occur. Mrs. Caldwell, Senator Crawford said, during the final tour session, your operation demonstrates exactly the kind of economic sophistication that Congress expects from potential states. But success in one location doesn't necessarily indicate broader territorial capacity. How do we know this isn't an isolated example rather than representative of Montana's general development potential? Cordelia had anticipated this question and prepared her response carefully. Senator, isolation would indeed be a concern if this were the only advanced operation in the territory. But it's not. She gestured toward a map showing locations of existing and planned facilities throughout Montana. We're currently expanding to 3 additional locations, with detailed plans for further development based on demonstrated demand and available resources. She pulled out contracts and correspondence that documented interest from investors, suppliers, and markets throughout the western United States. The demand for high-quality products from Montana operations exceeds our current capacity by a factor of 5. The limitation isn't market opportunity, it's our ability to expand production quickly enough to meet existing demand. Congressman Hayes examined the market projections with growing enthusiasm. These numbers suggest that Montana could become a major supplier to the entire western region within a decade. Not just a supplier, a leader, Cordelia corrected. Our methods are being studied by operations in Colorado, Wyoming, and California. Montana isn't catching up to established agricultural regions. We're pioneering approaches that they're trying to adopt. The political implications of her statement were not lost on the delegation. A territory that led rather than followed would strengthen the western region's influence in national politics while creating economic opportunities that would benefit constituencies in multiple states. That evening, the delegation attended a formal dinner where territorial leaders presented their case for statehood with speeches, presentations, and carefully orchestrated demonstrations of Montana's political and economic maturity. Cordelia found herself seated between Senator Crawford and Congressman Hayes, positioned to answer questions and provide details that would influence their final recommendations to Congress. Mrs. Caldwell, Crawford said during the main course, your presentation today was impressive, but I have concerns about sustainability. Rapid expansion often leads to quality problems, financial overextension, and operational failures that damage entire industries. How do you ensure that growth doesn't compromise the standards that have made your success possible? Through systematic scaling rather than haphazard expansion, Cordelia replied. Each new facility is developed using proven procedures, staffed with trained personnel, and integrated into existing supply and distribution networks before opening. We expand capacity only after demonstrating that current operations can support additional volume without compromising quality. She explained the detailed planning process that governed their expansion strategy, including financial controls, quality assurance protocols, and management structures that maintained consistency across multiple locations. The congressman listened with obvious interest, occasionally exchanging glances that suggested they were revising their initial assessments of Montana's readiness for statehood. What about competition? Asked Congressman Hayes. Success like yours inevitably attracts competitors who try to replicate your methods. How do you maintain market advantages when others begin offering similar products? Continuous innovation, Cordelia answered immediately. We don't defend existing advantages. We create new ones faster than competitors can copy our current methods. While they're learning to match what we did last year, we're developing techniques they won't understand for another 5 years. She described research partnerships with agricultural colleges, experimental programs testing new breeds and feeding methods, and technology investments that would further improve efficiency and quality. The scope of their innovation efforts clearly surprised the delegation, who had apparently expected to find crude frontier operations rather than sophisticated enterprises that rivaled the best Eastern establishments. The conversation continued through dinner and into the evening reception that followed, with various delegation members seeking Cordelia's opinions on topics ranging from transportation, infrastructure to territorial taxation policies. By the time the formal events concluded, she had established herself as someone whose insights carried weight with people who would influence Montana's political future. 3 days after the delegation's departure, Governor Richardson summoned Cordelia to Helena for a private meeting that would reveal the results of their collective efforts. She found him in his office, surrounded by telegrams, letters, and reports that suggested significant developments in Montana's statehood prospects. "The delegation's preliminary report is extremely positive," Richardson announced without preamble. "Senator Crawford specifically cited your operation as evidence that Montana possesses the economic sophistication necessary for statehood. Congressman Hayes recommended that Congress fast-track our application based on demonstrated capacity for advanced commercial development." Richardson handed her a telegram from Washington that contained language she had never expected to see. "They're proposing to introduce statehood legislation during the fall session, with formal admission possible as early as next spring. Your demonstration convinced them that Montana represents opportunity rather than obligation." The implications were staggering. Statehood would bring federal funding for infrastructure development, representation in Congress that could influence national policies affecting Western development, and political recognition that would attract additional investment and settlement. Montana would transition from territorial afterthought to full participant in national affairs, with all the opportunities and responsibilities that status entailed. "Governor," Cordelia said carefully, "this success creates new obligations as well as opportunities. People who influence statehood decisions will expect to continue influencing state policies after admission. Precisely why I wanted to discuss future arrangements with you," Richardson replied. "Statehood will require a new constitution, election of state officials, and establishment of governmental structures that can handle Montana's transition from territorial to state status. We need people with demonstrated leadership capabilities to take on these responsibilities." He pulled out documents that outlined proposed governmental structures and highlighted positions that would need to be filled by qualified candidates. "The legislature will need representatives who understand both business and politics. State agencies will need administrators who can manage complex operations efficiently. And we'll need leaders who can represent Montana's interests effectively in dealings with federal officials and other states." Cordelia studied the documents with a growing understanding of what Richardson was proposing. Her business success had positioned her to play a major role in shaping Montana's political future, but accepting such responsibilities would require commitments that extended far beyond managing ranching operations. "What specific role are you suggesting?" "Multiple possibilities," Richardson replied. "State senator representing the northern districts where your business interests are concentrated. Director of the State Agricultural Development Agency, where your expertise would guide policies affecting the entire agricultural sector. Or territorial representative to the Constitutional Convention that will draft Montana's founding documents." Each option offered different opportunities to influence Montana's development while creating different demands on her time and attention. State senators would provide direct political power, but require extensive travel and involvement in legislative processes. Agency directors would allow focus on agricultural development, but limit influence over broader policy areas. Constitutional Convention delegates would shape fundamental governmental structures, but involve temporary rather than ongoing responsibilities. "I need time to consider the implications and discuss options with my business partner," Cordelia said. "Finally, of course," Richardson agreed. "But I should mention that several people have already expressed interest in these positions, including some who might not share your commitment to Montana's long-term development rather than short-term political gain." The subtle warning was clear. If Cordelia declined to participate in Montana's political transition, others with different priorities and potentially less competence would fill the leadership vacuum. Her success had created an obligation to help ensure that statehood benefited Montana's residents rather than outside interests seeking to exploit new opportunities. As she prepared to return to the ranch, Cordelia reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from her father's gambling debt to the threshold of territorial political leadership. Less than a year ago, she had property sold for whiskey bottles. Now she was being invited to help write the laws and policies that would govern Montana for generations to come. The transformation was nearly complete, but the most crucial decisions still lay ahead. The woman who had been broken and discarded was about to become one of the most powerful people in a future state, with the opportunity to shape not just her own destiny, but the fate of an entire region. The only question was whether she possessed the courage to claim the full extent of the power that her achievements had earned. The letter that changed everything arrived on a crisp October morning when autumn was painting the Montana mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Cordelia was reviewing quarterly financial reports in the ranch office when Mrs. Patterson knocked and entered with an expression that suggested significant news. The envelope she carried bore the official seal of the United States Congress and the weight of decisions that would reshape an entire territory. "This came with the morning mail," Mrs. Patterson said, setting the letter on Cordelia's desk with the reverence reserved for documents that could alter destinies. "The postmaster said it was sent from Washington with special priority delivery." Cordelia opened the envelope carefully, aware that Jeremiah had paused his own work to observe her reaction. The formal language of official correspondence filled 2 pages, but the essential message was contained in the opening paragraph. Congress had voted to admit Montana to the Union as the 41st state, with statehood to take effect on November 8, 1889. "We did it," she said quietly, looking up at Jeremiah with an expression that mixed triumph with the sobering realization of what lay ahead. "Montana will be a state in less than a month." The weeks that followed brought a whirlwind of activity as the territory prepared for its transformation into statehood. Constitutional conventions convened to draft fundamental laws. Election campaigns began for positions that would shape the new state's future, and business leaders across Montana scrambled to position themselves advantageously for the opportunities that statehood would create. Cordelia found herself at the center of discussions that would determine not just Montana's political structure, but the direction of its economic development for decades to come. Her reputation as someone who had successfully navigated both business complexity and political negotiations made her opinion valuable to people seeking to understand how statehood would affect their own interests. "Mrs. Caldwell," announced Frederick Harrison, a well-dressed man who appeared at the ranch one afternoon representing what he described as a consortium of Eastern investors with substantial interest in Montana's future development. Harrison was younger than the previous visitor, but his manner suggested the same combination of financial resources and carefully calculated objectives. "We understand you've been offered significant positions in the new state government," Harrison continued, settling into the chair across from Cordelia's desk without waiting for an invitation. "We're here to discuss how those positions might be leveraged to create mutually beneficial opportunities for everyone involved." Cordelia studied Harrison with the wariness she had learned to apply to unsolicited offers that promised easy profits. His clothes were expensive, his confidence was absolute, and his assumption that she would be interested in leveraging political positions for financial gain revealed assumptions about her character that were both insulting and strategically dangerous. "Mr. Harrison, I'm not sure what you mean by leveraging government positions. Perhaps you could be more specific about what your consortium is proposing." Harrison smiled with the satisfaction of someone who believed he was offering an irresistible opportunity. "State Senator, Agricultural Agency Director, Constitutional Convention Delegate. These positions provide access to information, influence over policy decisions, and relationships with people who control significant resources. Smart positioning of those advantages could generate enormous returns for properly structured partnerships. He produced documents outlining investment strategies that would use Cordelia's political access to secure advantageous contracts, influence regulatory decisions, and direct state resources toward projects that would benefit private investors. The proposed arrangements were sophisticated, potentially legal, and completely contrary to everything she believed about public service. "Mr. Harrison," Cordelia replied with steel entering her voice, "I think you've misunderstood both my character and my intentions. Political positions are opportunities to serve the public interest, not vehicles for private profit." Harrison's confidence wavered slightly, but he pressed forward with the determination of someone who had invested significant time in developing his proposal. "Mrs. Caldwell, with respect, idealism is a luxury that few people can afford. Political positions require financial resources to maintain, and those resources have to come from somewhere. We're simply offering a more structured approach to arrangements that develop naturally anyway." "The arrangements you're describing would constitute corruption," Cordelia said flatly. "I'm not interested in corrupting myself with the positions. I might accept. Find someone else for your schemes." Harrison's mask of politeness slipped completely. "You're making a mistake. Montana's political landscape is going to be shaped by people who understand practical realities. Refusing to participate in those arrangements won't prevent them from happening. It will just ensure that you're excluded from the benefits." "Then I'll be excluded," Cordelia replied, standing to indicate that the meeting was over. "Some things matter more than personal profit." After Harrison's departure, Cordelia sat alone in the office, contemplating the implications of what she had just rejected. Harrison was probably correct that Montana's political development would involve exactly the kind of arrangements he had proposed. Statehood would bring enormous opportunities for private gain through public position, and people with fewer scruples than hers would undoubtedly pursue those opportunities aggressively. The question was whether she could accomplish meaningful public service while competing against individuals who were willing to use their positions for personal enrichment. Political effectiveness might require resources that could only be obtained through the very compromises she found unacceptable. Jeremiah emerged from the back office, where he had been listening to the conversation with Harrison. His expression suggested both approval of her response and concern about the challenges she would face in political office. "You realize that refusing those arrangements puts you at a disadvantage against people who accept them," he said, settling into the chair. Harrison had vacated. "I realize that accepting them would make me someone I don't want to become," Cordelia replied. "Political power obtained through corruption isn't worth having, and success built on compromised principles won't last." "Noble sentiments, Jeremiah." "Agreed, but politics is about practical results, not moral purity. How do you plan to be effective against opponents who aren't constrained by your ethical standards?" The question highlighted the central dilemma she faced in considering political involvement. Public service required engaging with a system that included people whose methods she found objectionable. Maintaining her principles might limit her effectiveness, but abandoning them would defeat the purpose of seeking office in the first place. By being better prepared, more knowledgeable, and more committed to long-term success than people who focus on short-term gain, she answered finally. "Corruption is ultimately inefficient because it prioritizes private benefit over public good. Systems built on corruption eventually collapse because they don't serve the broader interests that sustain them. And if you're wrong, if the corrupt officials achieve more immediate success while you're building long-term strategies, then at least I'll be able to live with the consequences of my choices," Cordelia said. "I'd rather fail honorably than succeed through methods that make success meaningless." The Constitutional Convention that would draft Montana's fundamental laws convened in Helena on October 4th, bringing together representatives from across the territory to debate issues that would affect generations of future residents. Cordelia had accepted Governor Richardson's invitation to serve as a delegate, recognizing that the opportunity to shape Montana's founding documents might never arise again. The convention hall buzzed with the energy of historic decision-making. As delegates took their seats for discussions that would determine everything from taxation, policies to voting rights to the structure of state government, Cordelia found herself surrounded by men whose backgrounds ranged from established ranchers to mining magnates to territorial officials, many of whom had never worked alongside a woman in such a formal political setting. "Gentlemen," announced Convention President William Clark, a mining entrepreneur whose vast wealth had made him one of Montana's most influential residents, "we are gathered to create the legal foundation for what will become one of America's great states. The decisions we make here will echo through Montana's history for generations to come." The first week of debates focused on basic governmental structure, the number of legislative districts, the powers of various state offices, and the relationship between state and local authorities. Cordelia listened carefully to the arguments, taking detailed notes and observing the patterns of alliance and opposition that would influence more contentious discussions ahead. When debates turned to economic development policies, she found herself increasingly involved in discussions that would directly affect Montana's future prosperity. Her reputation as someone who understood both business operations and market dynamics made her opinion valuable on issues ranging from taxation policies to railroad regulation to agricultural development incentives. "Mrs. Caldwell," said Delegate Robert Sterling during a heated debate about mining taxation, "you've built one of the territory's most successful business operations. What's your view on whether extractive industries should pay higher taxes than agricultural enterprises?" The question was politically loaded, pitting mining interests against agricultural concerns in a debate that could influence Montana's economic development for decades. Cordelia had anticipated this moment and prepared her response carefully. "Taxation policy should be based on sustainable revenue generation rather than favoritism toward particular industries," she replied, addressing the entire convention rather than just Sterling. "Mining operations generate substantial short-term revenues, but deplete finite resources. Agricultural operations generate smaller immediate returns, but can sustain production indefinitely with proper management." She stood and moved to the front of the chamber, commanding attention with the confidence she had developed through months of high-stakes negotiations. Montana's tax structure should encourage long-term development while capturing fair revenue from operations that extract irreplaceable resources. That means reasonable taxation of sustainable industries and higher rates for enterprises that consume non-renewable assets. The logic of her argument was difficult to dispute, but several delegates who represented mining interests responded with objections based on the immediate economic importance of extraction industries. The debate continued for hours, with various representatives arguing for tax policies that would favor their constituents' specific interests. Cordelia's position gradually gained support from delegates who recognized that Montana's long-term prosperity required diversified economic development rather than dependence on industries that would eventually exhaust their resource base. Her reputation for business success gave weight to arguments that might have been dismissed if proposed by people without demonstrated economic expertise. "The lady from the Northern District makes compelling points," acknowledged Delegate Thomas Walsh, whose legal background had made him influential in constitutional discussions. "Montana's Constitution should encourage the kind of sustainable development that will support our state's growth for generations, not just the next few years." By the end of the second week, Cordelia had established herself as one of the convention's most respected voices on economic policy. Her proposals were being incorporated into draft language. Her amendments were receiving serious consideration, and her support was being sought by delegates working on various aspects of Montana's fundamental law. The most significant test of her influence came during debates about women's suffrage, an issue that divided the convention between progressive delegates who supported equal voting rights and traditionalists who believed political participation should remain limited to men. Cordelia had known this moment would come, and she had prepared arguments that went beyond moral appeals to practical considerations about Montana's future development. "Gentlemen," she said, rising to address the convention during the climactic suffrage debate, "this is not merely a question of abstract rights or social theory. This is a question of whether Montana will utilize all of its human resources to build the strongest possible state." She gestured toward the gallery where women had gathered to observe the proceedings. "The women in this territory have demonstrated their capabilities in business, education, and community development. Excluding them from political participation wastes talents that Montana needs to compete successfully with more established states." Her argument continued for 20 minutes, weaving together economic analysis, practical examples, and moral reasoning that challenged delegates to consider the long-term implications of their decision. When she finished, the convention hall was silent except for the scratch of pens as reporters recorded her words for newspapers that would carry the debate to readers across the nation. The vote that followed was closer than anyone had anticipated. 28 in favor of women's suffrage, 26 opposed, with one abstention that reflected the political courage of a delegate who couldn't bring himself to vote against the woman whose arguments had shaped so much of Montana's constitutional development. As delegates filed out of the convention hall that evening, many stopped to congratulate Cordelia on both her victory and her performance throughout the proceedings. She had not merely participated in Montana's constitutional convention. She had influenced its outcomes in ways that would affect the state's development for generations. "Mrs. Caldwell," said President Clark as the hall emptied, "you've distinguished yourself here in ways that suggest a significant political future. Have you given thought to what office you might seek when Montana holds its first state elections?" The question that would determine the final phase of her transformation was finally being asked directly. Cordelia looked around the now empty convention hall where she had helped write the laws that would govern Montana's future, and realized that her journey from purchased bride to territorial ruler was approaching its climactic moment. The question of what office Cordelia might seek hung in the Montana air like smoke from autumn fires, heavy with possibility and consequence. As delegates departed Helena after approving Montana's constitution, word spread throughout the territory that the woman who had been sold for whiskey was being courted for the state's highest political positions. The transformation was so complete, so unprecedented, that newspapers from San Francisco to New York began sending reporters to chronicle what they termed the most remarkable rise in American political history. President Clark's inquiry about her political future had been more than casual conversation. Within days of the convention's conclusion, a formal delegation arrived at the ranch carrying an invitation that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The delegation included prominent businessmen, respected lawyers, and territorial officials who had come to request that Cordelia Caldwell consider seeking election as Montana's first elected governor. "Mrs. Caldwell," announced Jonathan Bradley, a Helena banker whose support could influence elections throughout the territory, "Montana needs leadership that combines business expertise with political vision. Your performance at the Constitutional Convention demonstrated exactly the qualities our new state requires." The delegation had assembled in the ranch's main parlor, transforming the room where Cordelia had once planned cattle breeding schedules into a setting for discussions that would determine Montana's political future. She studied the faces of men who represented different regions, industries, and political philosophies, but who had united behind the unprecedented idea of supporting a woman for the territory's highest office. The position requires someone who understands economic development, can work effectively with federal officials, and has demonstrated ability to build coalitions around complex issues, continued William Murphy, a Butte lawyer whose mining clients had initially opposed her constitutional proposals, but who had come to respect her practical approach to policy development. It also requires someone who can't be bought, corrupted, or intimidated by the special interests that will try to influence Montana's early development, added Samuel Pierce, a rancher from the eastern counties whose support represented the agricultural constituencies that formed Montana's economic foundation. Cordelia listened to their arguments while calculating the implications of what they proposed. The coming governor would provide an unprecedented opportunity to shape Montana's development according to principles of sustainable growth and ethical governance. But it would also expose her to political attacks, require abandoning direct management of the business empire she had built, and demand skills in legislative leadership and federal relations that she had never been forced to develop. "What makes you believe I could be effective in such a position?" she asked, genuinely curious about their assessment of her qualifications. Bradley leaned forward with the intensity of someone who had thought carefully about his answer. "3 things. First, you've demonstrated the ability to master complex problems and develop innovative solutions. Second, you've shown that you can work with people who initially opposed you and build consensus around controversial issues. Third, you've proven that you won't compromise your principles for personal advantage." Murphy nodded in agreement. Montana's first governor will face enormous challenges, negotiating with federal officials who don't understand Western conditions, managing the transition from territorial to state administration, balancing competing demands from different regions and industries. "We need someone with demonstrated problem-solving abilities and unquestionable integrity. There's also the practical consideration," Pierce added with a slight smile. "Your opponents in the election would be men who've spent years building political networks and accumulating favors. But you've accomplished more in 2 years than most of them have achieved in decades. Voters recognize genuine achievement when they see it." The conversation continued for hours as the delegation outlined their vision for Montana's early statehood period and explained how Cordelia's background positioned her to address the challenges that lay ahead. They had clearly researched her business methods, studied her constitutional convention performance, and concluded that her combination of practical experience and ethical principles made her uniquely qualified for executive leadership. "I need time to consider the implications and discuss this with my business partner," Cordelia said finally. "Accepting such a position would require fundamental changes in how I manage my existing responsibilities." "Of course," Bradley replied. "But I should mention that word of our visit will spread quickly, and other potential candidates are already beginning their campaigns. If you're serious about seeking the office, you'll need to begin organizing support soon." After the delegation's departure, Cordelia and Jeremiah spent the evening reviewing the extraordinary request and its implications for both their business partnership and their personal relationship. The ranch office where they had planned cattle operations and processing facility expansions now served as the setting for discussions about political strategy and governmental responsibility. "You realize that accepting this nomination changes everything," Jeremiah said, studying financial projections that showed how the business could continue operating without Cordelia's daily involvement. "Governor is not a part-time position. You'd be giving up direct control of the enterprise we've built together. Not giving up delegating," Cordelia corrected. "We've developed management systems and trained personnel who can handle operations without constant supervision. And the political connections that come with the governor's office could benefit the business in ways that would offset reduced direct involvement." Jeremiah nodded thoughtfully. "There's also the question of what happens if you lose. Running for governor and failing could damage your reputation and influence in ways that would affect business relationships." "There's equal risk in not running," Cordelia replied. "If someone else becomes governor and pursues policies that damage Montana's economic development, our business interests could suffer regardless of how well we manage our own operations." They spent hours analyzing the political landscape, identifying potential supporters and opponents, and developing strategies for a campaign that would be unlike anything Montana had ever experienced. The challenge was not just winning an election, but convincing voters to take an unprecedented step by electing a woman to executive office. "The Constitutional Convention established your credibility with political leaders," Jeremier observed. "But governors are elected by all voters, not just convention delegates. You'll need to appeal to people who've never seen a woman in political leadership." "Which could be an advantage," Cordelia suggested. "People who are frustrated with traditional politicians might be attracted to someone who represents genuine change rather than merely different rhetoric." The campaign that followed tested every aspect of Cordelia's character, intelligence, and determination. Her opponents included established territorial officials who questioned her qualifications, mining magnates who resented her constitutional positions, and traditional politicians who argued that executive leadership required masculine qualities that no woman could possess. But Cordelia's campaign strategy neutralized many traditional disadvantages by focusing on concrete achievements rather than abstract promises. While her opponents made speeches about what they hoped to accomplish, she pointed to businesses she had built, problems she had solved, and policies she had already influenced through Constitutional Convention participation. "Citizens of Montana," she declared during a campaign rally in Helena that drew the largest political crowd in territorial history, "this election is not about whether a woman can serve as governor. It's about whether you want leadership based on demonstrated results or empty promises from career politicians." The crowd's response was unlike anything Montana politics had previously experienced. Women who had gained voting rights through the Constitutional Convention attended campaign events in unprecedented numbers. Ranchers and farmers who had heard about her business innovations came to hear her positions on agricultural development. Even mining workers, despite their employers' opposition, showed interest in her proposals for labor protections and economic diversification. "Mrs. Caldwell has done more for Montana in 2 years than some of these other candidates have accomplished in their entire careers," declared Pete Hawkins during a campaign event in Bitterroot Creek, the same town where Cordelia's journey had begun. "She turned a failing ranch into a business empire and helped write the Constitution that will govern our state. What more qualifications does anyone need?" The opposition campaign grew increasingly desperate as Election Day approached, and polling suggested that Cordelia's support was stronger than anyone had anticipated. Attacks on her background intensified, with opponents highlighting her unconventional arrival in Montana and questioning whether someone with such limited political experience could handle the complexities of state government. "It also requires someone who can't be bought, corrupted, or intimidated by the special interests that will try to influence Montana's early development," added Samuel Pierce, a rancher from the eastern counties whose support represented the agricultural constituencies that formed Montana's economic foundation. Cordelia listened to their arguments while calculating the implications of what they proposed. Becoming governor would provide an unprecedented opportunity to shape Montana's development according to principles of sustainable growth and ethical governance. But it would also expose her to political attacks, require abandoning direct management of the business empire she had built, and demand skills in legislative leadership and federal relations that she had never been forced to develop. "What makes you believe I could be effective in such a position?" she asked, genuinely curious about their assessment of her qualifications. Bradley leaned forward with the intensity of someone who had thought carefully about his answer. "3 things. First, you've demonstrated the ability to master complex problems and develop innovative solutions. Second, You've shown that you can work with people who initially opposed you and build consensus around controversial issues. Third, you've proven that you won't compromise your principles for personal advantage. Murphy nodded in agreement. Montana's first governor will face enormous challenges, negotiating with federal officials who don't understand Western conditions, managing the transition from territorial to state administration, balancing competing demands from different regions and industries. We need someone with demonstrated problem-solving abilities and unquestionable integrity. There's also the practical consideration, Pierce added with a slight smile. Your opponents in the election would be men who've spent years building political networks and accumulating favors. But you've accomplished more in 2 years than most of them have achieved in decades. Voters recognize genuine achievement when they see it. The conversation continued for hours as the delegation outlined their vision for Montana's early statehood period and explained how Cordelia's background positioned her to address the challenges that lay ahead. They had clearly researched her business methods, studied her constitutional convention performance, and concluded that her combination of practical experience and ethical principles made her uniquely qualified for executive leadership. I need time to consider the implications and discuss this with my business partner, Cordelia said finally. Accepting such a position would require fundamental changes in how I manage my existing responsibilities. Of course, Bradley replied. But I should mention that word of our visit will spread quickly, and other potential candidates are already beginning their campaigns. If you're serious about seeking the office, you'll need to begin organizing support soon. After the delegation's departure, Cordelia and Jeremiah spent the evening reviewing the extraordinary request and its implications for both their business partnership and their personal relationship. The ranch office where they had planned cattle operations and processing facility expansions now served as the setting for discussions about political strategy and governmental responsibility. You realize that accepting this nomination changes everything, Jeremiah said, studying financial projections that showed how the business could continue operating without Cordelia's daily involvement. Governor is not a part-time position. You'd be giving up direct control of the enterprise we've built together, not giving up delegating, Cordelia corrected. We've developed management systems and trained personnel who can handle operations without constant supervision. And the political connections that come with the governor's office could benefit the business in ways that would offset reduced direct involvement. Jeremiah nodded thoughtfully. There's also the question of what happens if you lose. Running for governor and failing could damage your reputation and influence in ways that would affect business relationships. There's equal risk in not running, Cordelia replied. If someone else becomes governor and pursues policies that damage Montana's economic development, our business interests could suffer regardless of how well we manage our own operations. They spent hours analyzing the political landscape, identifying potential supporters and opponents, and developing strategies for a campaign that would be unlike anything Montana had ever experienced. The challenge was not just winning an election, but convincing voters to take an unprecedented step by electing a woman to executive office. The Constitutional Convention established your credibility with political leaders, Jeremiah observed. But governors are elected by all voters, not just convention delegates. You'll need to appeal to people who've never seen a woman in political leadership, which could be an advantage, Cordelia suggested. People who are frustrated with traditional politicians might be attracted to someone who represents genuine change rather than merely different rhetoric. The campaign that followed tested every aspect of Cordelia's character, intelligence, and determination. Her opponents included established territorial officials who questioned her qualifications, mining magnates who resented her constitutional positions, and traditional politicians who argued that executive leadership required masculine qualities that no woman could possess. But Cordelia's campaign strategy neutralized many traditional disadvantages by focusing on concrete achievements rather than abstract promises. While her opponents made speeches about what they hoped to accomplish, she pointed to businesses she had built, problems she had solved, and policies she had already influenced through Constitutional Convention participation. Citizens of Montana, she declared during a campaign rally in Helena that drew the largest political crowd in territorial history. This election is not about whether a woman can serve as governor. It's about whether you want leadership based on demonstrated results or empty promises from career politicians. The crowd's response was unlike anything Montana politics had previously experienced. Women who had gained voting rights through the Constitutional Convention attended campaign events in unprecedented numbers. Ranchers and farmers who had heard about her business innovations came to hear her positions on agricultural development. Even mining workers, despite their employers' opposition, showed interest in her proposals for labor protections and economic diversification. Mrs. Caldwell has done more for Montana in 2 years than some of these other candidates have accomplished in their entire careers, declared Pete Hawkins during a campaign event in Bitterroot Creek, the same town where Cordelia's journey had begun. She turned a failing ranch into a business empire and helped write the Constitution that will govern our state. What more qualifications does anyone need? The opposition campaign grew increasingly desperate as Election Day approached, and polling suggested that Cordelia's support was stronger than anyone had anticipated. Attacks on her background intensified, with opponents highlighting her unconventional arrival in Montana and questioning whether someone with such limited political experience could handle the complexities of state government. "My opponents want to discuss my past," Cordelia responded during the final campaign debate, held in Helena before an audience that included reporters from Eastern newspapers. "Very well. 2 years ago, I was property sold for 3 bottles of whiskey. Today, I'm a candidate for governor of Montana." That transformation didn't happen through luck or favoritism. It happened through hard work, smart decisions, and commitment to principles that put public good ahead of private gain. The audience fell silent as she continued. "My opponents have spent years building political careers. I've spent 2 years building Montana's economic future. You can choose leadership that talks about progress or leadership that delivers it. But you can't have both from the same candidate." The debate performance became the defining moment of the campaign, quoted in newspapers across the country and cementing Cordelia's reputation as someone who could turn apparent disadvantages into compelling arguments for her candidacy. When Election Day arrived on November 5, 1889, 3 days before Montana's official statehood, voter turnout exceeded all previous records. The results shocked political observers throughout the Western United States. Cordelia won 43% of the vote in a 4-candidate race, enough to claim victory without requiring a runoff election. Her margin was largest in rural areas where voters had direct experience with her business methods, but she also carried urban districts where women's votes provided crucial support. "Citizens of Montana," she declared during her victory speech on the steps of the territorial capital, "today you have chosen progress over tradition, innovation over complacency, and results over rhetoric. Together, we will build a state that serves as a model for the entire American West." The inauguration ceremony on January 2, 1890, drew visitors from across the nation who came to witness what newspapers called the most remarkable political transformation in American history. Cordelia took the oath of office as Montana's first elected governor, becoming the first woman to hold such a position in any American state. The ceremony itself was held in the new state capitol building, with an audience that included federal officials, business leaders, and hundreds of ordinary Montanans who had supported her campaign. When Chief Justice William Clark administered the oath, his voice carried recognition of the historic significance of the moment. "I, Cordelia Caldwell, do solemnly swear that I will support, protect, and defend the Constitution and laws of the United States, and the Constitution and laws of the state of Montana, and that I will discharge the duties of my office with fidelity. So help me God." The words echoed through the Capitol chamber and across a territory that had officially become a state just 2 months earlier. In the audience, Jeremiah watched with visible pride as his business partner completed a transformation that had begun in a frozen saloon where her father had gambled away his last asset. The first months of Cordelia's governorship established patterns of leadership that would define Montana's early statehood period. She recruited administrators based on competence rather than political connections, implemented policies that encouraged sustainable economic development, and established relationships with federal officials that positioned Montana favorably for infrastructure investments and territorial expansion. Her agricultural development initiatives built on innovations pioneered at the Caldwell Ranch, encouraging farmers and ranchers throughout the state to adopt methods that increased productivity while protecting natural resources. Her mining policies balanced immediate revenue needs with long-term environmental concerns, establishing Montana as a leader in responsible resource extraction. Most significantly, her administration became a model for Western states seeking to balance rapid development with sustainable growth. Governors from Colorado, Wyoming, and California sent representatives to study Montana's policies and administrative methods, spreading Cordelia's influence far beyond state boundaries. Governor Caldwell has demonstrated that effective leadership transcends traditional assumptions about gender roles, editorialized the Denver Post during her first year in office. Montana's success under her administration suggests that political merit should be measured by results rather than conventional qualifications. The transformation from purchased bride to territorial ruler was complete, but its implications extended far beyond Cordelia's personal achievement. Her success opened political possibilities for women throughout the American West, while demonstrating that unconventional backgrounds could produce exceptional leadership. Years later, when historians analyzed the factors that had made Montana one of the most successfully governed Western states, they would consistently cite the principles that Cordelia had established during her gubernatorial administration: merit-based appointments, sustainable development policies, and ethical governance that prioritize public service over private gain. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of her story was how completely she had redefined herself and her circumstances. The woman who had been sold for whiskey had used intelligence, determination, and uncompromising principles to build not just personal success but institutional changes that would benefit generations of future Montanans. In the governor's mansion, where she now lived, surrounded by symbols of political power that would have seemed impossible during her father's darkest moments, Cordelia kept a small reminder of her journey. 3 empty whiskey bottles sat on a shelf in her private study, not as symbols of shame but as proof that any circumstances, no matter how degrading, could be transformed through vision, effort, and refusal to accept limitations imposed by others. Silent Cattle Baron still managed his ranch operations with the same systematic efficiency that had built an empire from nothing. But now he did so as the business partner of Montana's governor, watching with quiet satisfaction as the woman he had purchased for 3 bottles of whiskey ruled an entire territory with wisdom that kings would have envied. The transaction that had seemed like the end of Cordelia's story had actually been its beginning. And the empire they had built together, commercial, political, and personal, stood as permanent proof that true worth could never be measured in whiskey bottles or determined by the failures of others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.